All right, excellent. So we are here with Pat Libby. We just went from DC over from the East Coast over to the West Coast. So thank you for getting up early to be with us today. And Libby, I've been so lucky through my consulting practice to be able to meet so many other amazing advocacy pros. And Libby was one of them. We just actually met recently in the past year. And she's going to break down the complicated process of passing a law into 10 simple steps. As advocacy pros, we are often tasked with explaining this process to our advocates and why we do things. And so she's going to talk about how to become an empowered citizen, 10 steps to passing a law. She just a little bit more about her professional background. She's one of the nation's leading experts on citizen lobbying campaign. She's a longtime nonprofit leader, consultant, and academic. And Pat has made it her mission to teach people how to create change through the legislative process. I feel similarly. She loves to share her passion for transformational change. And she's also the author of a book that she's going to talk about and show us. And the first 10 people who signed up for our Advocacy Pro package, which has been sold out, the first 10, not the Advocacy Pro package. Well, we have 10 people who have already signed up, are going to get her book. So that'll be really exciting. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Pat. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much. And I'm going to jump in by sharing my screen so that everyone can see my slides. All right. Great. All right. So as Bethany mentioned, my most recent book is called The Empowered Citizen's Guide. And I am a recovering academic. So my other books have been textbooks. And this is the first book that I've written for the general public. And the idea came about because my editor said, I love this book and I want a book like this for me. So this is a really simple, easy to follow guide for passing a law. So today I'm going to divide my talk into two components. First, I'm going to talk about a really simple framework for understanding the lawmaking process. And as I've been going around and giving book talks, I found that so many people who are scientists and researchers and attorneys have no idea how laws get made in the most simplest form. So I'm just going to demystify that for everybody. And then I'm going to talk about not all of the 10 steps, but I'm going to talk about the framework and some of the things that I see advocates not doing as well as they could be doing. Okay, so first of all, I think we're all feeling a little bit like this post-election. It's been a little bit crazy. The dust hasn't quite settled. And I think for a lot of us, our first reaction is to tweet or get on social media and start, just gabbing about what's going on. But we really need to take action and figure out how we're going to move the needle on issues that are important to all of us. And so congratulations for being here today, because that's a really important first step. So as Bethany said, I created this 10-step framework to passing a law. And these ideas came from a time when I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. And once upon a time, I had this very glamorous job where I was the executive director of a group of community development corporations, neighborhood-based nonprofit developers that were all over the state of Massachusetts. And this was a 501c3 corporation. So I was hired for this job because I was supremely qualified. I didn't know anything about community development finance. I knew nothing about debt and equity. I knew nothing about lobbying, which was a big part of this job. So, but the organization only had $5,000 in the bank and it owed $3,000 in debt. So they weren't taking a big risk when they hired me. And for some reason, I had the audacity to think that I could move the needle and create change. And so I did. And what I did was I learned how to lobby by talking to friends and colleagues and just doing it and lobbying at the city level and at the state level, at the federal level. And I was pretty good at it. So fast forward, I become, oh, and I should say, I leverage hundreds of millions of dollars for community development organizations. And the thing that I'm most proud of is that the organization today is still a national model. And that just makes me really happy. Okay, so fast forward, I become an academic and I decide I'm going to teach my students how to lobby. And I design a course that's called Advocacy, Skills, and Strategies. And these are graduate students. And I tell them, okay, your assignment is to pass a law and to pass an original law that pertains to the work that you do as a nonprofit leader. And they all laughed at me and they thought I was being silly. And I thought, well, how am I going to teach these people how to pass a law? Like, what good books are around? What can I use? And I couldn't find anything. So I thought, well, how the heck did I do this? So I wrote these 10 steps down on a piece of paper and I taught them to my students. And then all of a sudden, they started passing really important laws in the state of California. The first law they passed was just a really simple but powerful law that included pets as part of domestic violence restraining orders, because some of my students worked for a domestic violence organization and they saw from the calls coming in that there were people who didn't want to leave their abusers because the abusers were threatening their pets. So that was a quick and easy law that they passed. It's in effect today. I had students pass laws that you might consider to be more significant than that, allowing the state of California to spend money in Mexico to clean up environmental pollution, raising the age through which foster youth would receive subsidies from the age of 18 to 26. That was a really significant law, tightening regulations on nursing homes and liability, mandating that coaches of all kinds of little league sports became background checked, and on and on and on and on. Excuse me. So the 10-step framework works. It really works. But before we get there, let's talk about how do you make a law? Like, how does this process even work? And I always start out with lawmaking as like sports. And I don't mean that it's teams, because even though it's feeling very team-like and tribal these days and people are rooting against one another, the reason that I say it's like sports is because I am married to a sports fanatic. And my husband will watch every single sport there is, and he knows all the lingos. So, I don't know what a breaking ball is in baseball. I don't know what an offside is. I don't know what all these plays are. He uses all this language. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about sports or, I do yoga. They have people say namaste and have all kinds of terminology for different yoga moves. So anything, any sport or any career, whether it's plumbing or electricity or whatever kind of work you do, has its own specialized language. And a lot of times people are intimidated by the lawmaking process because it has this language that we don't understand. So don't worry about that. This is all you need to know. A bill, which I'm going to define, and I'm going to use the term bill in a really broad sense, because you might be lobbying on something on a town level or a city level or a county level, and it might be called something different, like an ordinance or measure. Don't worry about that. I'm going to use bill generically for any kind of legislation which is a law that is in the process of being made. Okay, so it starts with a person, and this person is a legislator, and a legislator is any human being who has been elected to a position. Okay, so again, could be your city council member, could be someone from your board of supervisors, it could be someone in state government or someone in federal government. So you're going to talk to that person and you're going to say, this is the issue that's really important to our group. And this is, we want to talk to you about this. So that person has a little pen there and is responsible for taking your plain English language words and concepts and drafting it into legalese. Now, normally, if you're working with a city, for example, that is of a decent size, they're going to have a special legislative counsel. So they will have an in-house attorney who will help to draft that. If you're in a smaller government, they may not have that. And so you might want to be prepared with language that's been used in other cities or towns. But generally, there'll be someone to help you figure out how to craft this language. The next step is that it goes to a committee. So, and I bet if I asked all of you, how many of you have ever been part of a committee meeting? I think every single person on this screen would raise their hands, right? We've all been part of committees. So the committee has to do with the subject matter of your bill. It could be a fiscal issue, it could be environmental issue, it could be a human service issue. If you look at the names of the committees for the body that you're lobbying, you'll be able to figure it out. Now, sometimes you'll say, I don't know, it might have to go to 2 committees. In that case, you're going to want to talk to legislators who sit on each of those committees. And ideally, you want to talk to the person who chairs the committee to author your bill. All right, so just to recap, whoops, sorry, going forward, not backwards. Try this again. Oh man, a Shevitz. Sorry. Hold on, everybody. Hold on.
Oh, technology. We love it and hate it.
Yeah, I always tell everyone, I am the lowest tech person ever to have graduated from MIT. They made me write that on my diploma. It was kind of sad when it happened, but I accepted it. Okay, so let's try this again.
Yeah.
Here we go. Okay.
And folks, while Pat is getting her slides back up, be thinking about, we often have to explain this process to our advocates, to folks, be thinking about, do you feel like this is, just think about that and how you would approach this issue as well. All right.
Okay, so again, starting with the legislator, now ideally the person who serves on the committee or chairs the committee, writing up your language into legalese, bringing it to the committee. Okay, then it goes to a house. Now, if you're talking about the state level, let's just talk about the state or the federal level for a minute. It's going to go to one side of the house. So sometimes in every state except for Nebraska has 2 chambers, right? It's a House and a Senate. Sometimes it's called an assembly or House of Delegates, but fundamentally it's a House and a Senate. Senate has fewer people, the House has more. Okay. Then it passes out of the House because you've been such great lobbyists, and then it goes through the process on the other side. And when it goes through the process on the other side, the language has to match exactly, okay, in order for the bill to pass. And then a big cheese signs it, which is the governor, right? Now, if you're working on a local issue, let's say at a city level, oops, I'm sorry, here it is on the state level again. So it goes the author, brings it to the committee, brings it to the House, the other author on the other House brings it to that person's committee, goes to that House. It all looks good because it has the same language, and the big cheese signs it. That is the simplest way to look at the legislative process. If you are doing on a city level, the author brings it to a committee. There's only one House, right? If it's a city or a county or a town, it's only one House. Sometimes it's a big cheese, but sometimes there isn't. So sometimes you don't have a mayor who is legally allowed to sign or veto documents. Often at a county level, you don't have that. So there'll be a big cheese or not. So your job as an advocate is to influence each of these stages from the start to the beginning to the end. And I remember a really important law that my students attempted to pass, creating a registry of abusive caregivers to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they passed both houses by wide margins, and the governor vetoed it. And it was a really painful lesson, and that they forgot to lobby the governor and the governor's office. So you can't forget to pay attention to any of these steps while you are in the process of trying to pass a bill. Okay, now remember, there's all that tricky language. There are all these steps. You're going to have to testify and do these different things. When you do that, the legislative aid to the legislator you're working with will guide you through the process. And that person will be your Sherpa. And they will tell you, you need to show up. You need to make your voice heard, come with people, generate letters, generate phone calls, do all kinds of things to make your voice heard. Again, if you're working in a small town, then the Sherpa is going to be the legislator who's your teammate in helping you to pass this bill. But you don't have to know the whole process. That's their job, not your job. Your job is to know your issue. And I always say, you don't have to be a veterinarian to own a pet, right? You just have to love your pet, and you have to understand what your pet is all about and who that pet is as a creature. Same thing about lobbying. You just have to really understand your issue. That's what you need to understand, not the process, your issue, and talk about it in a way that is persuasive and rally the troops in a way that makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about some of the 10 steps. Okay, so I'm going to skip to step 3 because I'm going to highlight some of the steps today that I think I see over and over nonprofits doing poorly, and even national nonprofits that have been around for a long time. So it starts with the fact sheet has to have the title of your campaign, and we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. Your problem, what's the problem that you're trying to address? What's the solution, and how much does that cost? What kind of research have you done? Now, the research could be, you just survey people in your neighborhood, and you go door knocking and you say, we've talked to, 200 people in our neighborhood, and 147 of them said this. And we think that that's, a good number for being in support of our issue. If you're working on a bigger problem and you want more facts about the extent of a problem, you can call people who are faculty members at universities, because a lot of them do research all day long, and they're so happy to share that with you and to break it down into common sense so that you know what it is that you're talking about. And obviously your contact information and your coalition. And we're going to talk more about your coalition in a minute. The one thing that's really important is to make sure your terminology is accurate. And I was struck by this just the other day. I was reading an article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy about a group that's called the 97%. And you may have heard of this group. It was founded by a guy named John Goodwin, who was formerly with the NRA. And the reason they're called the 97% is because he says, surveys have shown that 97% of Americans are in favor of universal background checks on gun purchases. And he wants to, or he has formed this bipartisan organization in order to advance gun safety. And what he said, which was fascinating, I don't own a gun. I don't know anything about guns. I've never even seen a real gun, I don't think, in my life. What he said in this article is that there's no such thing as an assault weapon. I'm like, what? Really? He said there's no official definition for assault weapon. And when advocates talk about banning assault weapons, they are not using terminology that's relatable to people who own guns. And they sound like, according to him, coastal elites that want to take away your guns. So you have to think, when you're putting together your fact sheet, how you're going to use words that relate to as many people as possible in the most bipartisan way possible. Because it's not about a word war, it's about getting the law passed. So it's really important. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of a fact sheet that was created by a group of my students for a law that required, that mandated that computer repair technicians be mandated reporters of child pornography. So this idea came out of one of my students worked for an organization that provided counseling and support to people who tracked child pornography, because you can imagine how traumatic that must be, looking at those images day in and day out. And the student of mine looked at the law, and he saw in California, the last person or category of people who was mandated to be a reporter was a film developer. And he said, when is the last time you developed a roll of film? I mean, nobody does that anymore. People take their phones and, they do whatever. They don't go to the Rite Aid or CVS or whatever to develop their film. And he said, it just makes so much sense if we were to have computer and cell phone repair technicians be mandated reporters. So if they're working on a computer and up pops child pornography, they can basically confiscate that computer and report it to the police. So they outlined, as you could see on this fact sheet, the problem, the solution. What is it? What is child pornography? Again, let's get clear on a universal definition of what we're talking about. Then they talked about, on the backside of the sheet, other states that had already passed this law, members of their coalition, and we'll talk about that more in a second, the benefits of it, and then their contact information. So And you're thinking, wow, it's a piece of paper. And that's all it is. It's a double-sided piece of paper that has this information. This is what tells your story when you're lobbying. There's plenty of white space on it so that people can take notes. It calms your nerves down when you're meeting with legislators. So you remember where you are and what you're talking about. And it organizes your thoughts in a really clear way. Now, I always encourage groups to do two things: create this fact sheet and also to create a bigger position paper. And the position paper will have things like copies of these laws from other states, so that that will make it easier for the legislators to craft their own version of the law. The research that they did, which you can see in teeny tiny type, it's cited at the bottom, but that provides them with the real research and the links and a larger explanation of what it was that they found. So this is an example of what a really good fact sheet looks like. And I'll tell you, all the years I've been doing this, it's been many, 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 many years, I've never seen a fact sheet that's one and done, ever. It takes time. You got to figure it out. You've got to work on it. You find a friend who's good at graphic design so that it looks pretty, and you can communicate it. That's really important. Okay. So step 4 is branding the issue. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, how can we brand the issue after we have the fact sheet? Well, one thing I didn't tell you about the 10 steps is they're not really like stair steps. They're more like dance steps, because you don't go down the list and check something off. You go back and redo and refine as you go along. But let's talk about why brands are important for a minute. Brands can name and frame an issue in a really important way. I always like to talk about death tax, which is the frame that Republicans gave to inheritance tax. And right now, I think the law says that it's $12 million. If you inherit less than $12 million, you don't have to pay any tax on it. That is crazy. It used to be called inheritance tax, but when it became death tax, it sounded foreboding, right? And that allowed all of these wealthy Americans to not pay any tax because it was couched in these terms. Global warming became climate change because people said, wait a minute, it's not all warming. Sometimes it's colder. It's doing different things. It's not global warming. Living wage, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Living wage is basically a wage that allows the person to live, right? It's not minimum wage, it's above minimum wage. And that law started as a city law in Baltimore, then became a state law in Maryland, then became a law all over the United States, which is fascinating in many, many states. So they could have called it the get out of poverty wage or something else, but living wage was such a neat way to frame it. And marriage equality was a reframing of same-sex marriage, because when it was called equality, it brought the issue into a civil rights issue and broadened the framework of it. So you really want to think very strategically about the name and frame that you're giving to your campaign, because the name is important and it can help you persuade the opposition to come over to your side. It's really, really important. And I always say to people, if it's just groupthink, if it's only all of you, who agree with one another, who are working on the fact sheet and working on branding your issue, you're probably going to get stuck. So, call the uncle you always argue with and ask him why he objects to the issue, or call some other friendly people who you disagree with and get them to give you their opposition arguments, because it will help you think clearly about the best way to be strategic about naming and framing your issue. Okay.
Pat, I just want to bring up something. That is such a great point. I'm thinking about all campaigns that I've worked on, smoke-free campaigns. Also, one of we called it the Minnesota Freedom to Breathe Act. Who doesn't want the freedom to breathe? It sounds so much better than clean indoor air, which we also want.
Exactly.
Also, another one I worked on was and I have a whole workshop that I do. I just hope you don't mind. I just love this so much because I think about this all the time. Another one I worked on in Minnesota, because I've been in Minnesota for a long time, was it was a PE, but like to get kids to have to take minimum amounts of PE. It's a childhood obesity campaign. Yeah. And we had so much trouble getting other organizations involved because the lawmakers even called it the PE teacher's job bill, which was like a dagger. But like, we didn't care about PE teachers' jobs. Anyway, so we reframed it. We called it Minnesotans for Healthy Kids. Just, it was true. It brought in a broader group of coalition members, and then they actually still continue to this day and work on other childhood health issues. But I think this is something really important that is oftentimes hard. We have blinders on in this part. So thank you for bringing this up.
Good. Yeah, people take it for granted and they forget about it. All right. So now I'm going to talk about mapping out your supporters and detractors. And you're actually going to create two different maps. First, let's go back to the committees. All right. So we said at the beginning, you're going to research what committees you think or committee is going to hear your bill. And again, I'm using bill in this very generic sense. And you're going to find out, and it's so easy nowadays because you just go on the internet and do a little research, and you find out what these people are like what legislation have they supported in the past? What do they say about themselves? What do they have another job, or did they work before they got into elected office? Do they talk about their family? So do they have pets? Do they have they adopted children or foster children? You can find out a lot about people. And you want to make notes on each of these people, and you want to figure out, what can I say to Bethany that's going to convince her that she can relate to this issue? And the other thing you want to think about is, the 6 degrees of separation. Like, do you know anyone who went to high school or college with that person? Do you know anyone who goes to the same house of worship or plays Little League with their kids or whatever it is? So you really want to do a careful mapping of who those people are and where they're coming from on the issue. The second thing that you want to do is to create just a really rough map. I just like to use a piece of paper, like a big flip chart or a whiteboard, but you can, there's fancy software you can use to figure out, okay, what other organizations do we think are going to be on our side and supportive of this? Who do we think is going to be against us and why? And who aren't we sure about, who we might be able to convince to come over to our side? And you want to reach out to those organizations, particularly on the supporter side, to get their support. What's really important about this is to look for odd bedfellows. When I was lobbying for community development work, and I first started lobbying at the state level for money for affordable housing, I would meet with legislators and they would say, oh, Pat, you guys are all so selfish. You just want money to, pay the staff salaries of these directors of these nonprofits. And I would think, wow, that doesn't jive with me at all. Here are people with these sophisticated levels of expertise who are dedicating their lives to making their communities better. I don't see these people as being selfish, but I thought it's because we were only lobbying with ourselves. So then I thought, okay, let's bring in some bankers who invest in affordable housing deals. Let's bring in some environmentalists who see the value of improving these communities. And obviously, let's bring in people who live in the housing that has been created by these community development corporations. And lo and behold, we were much more successful. So it just can't be yourselves, because people will think you're selfish, even if you're not. It's got to be a broader circle that comes together. I want to give you, I'm going to go on. Okay. So then approaching electeds. I see a lot of people doing this well, and I see a lot of people really doing a bad job at this. You need to be nice to people. You need to be polite. I mean, when is the last time that someone yelled at you and you said, okay, I'll do what you want? It does not work that way. If someone says no to you, you need to find out why. What is their thinking? What might you be able to do to persuade them differently? Maybe if you're not successful with your initial ask, sometimes you can go back in the next legislative session and change some minds. So if you're prepared with the fact sheet, the white paper, you have a broad-based coalition, which has been identified on your fact sheet and your white paper, so people can see, who you are and what you're doing. That will convince them that you've got people behind you. The people who are lobbying the electives, newsflash, you must be registered to vote in the district of that person. And if you're not, you've got to find colleagues who are, and who are prominent parts of your coalition, who can take the lead role in speaking to these electeds. You want to write a thank you note afterwards. And one thing that you never want to do, which I've seen all the time, is you don't want to leave a meeting and then start talking trash in the hallway, because you don't know who every single person who works in the state house or city hall or county government, but they all know each other. So if you start about a person you just met with, other people are going to hear that and say, not thinking I really want to collaborate with those groups. So loose lips, sink ships, zip it up, be polite, be organized. And I guess finally, don't be bummed out if you can't meet with the elected. Sometimes you'll meet with a staff person first, and that's really good if that staff person is a policy person. So let me explain that on the state and federal level for a minute. So I live in San Diego, which is pretty close. We're about 20 minutes from the Mexican border. The capital of California is Sacramento, which is a plane ride away. It's basically a 2-hour plane ride, or probably an 8 or 10 hour car ride. I've never driven it. So if you go to the capital, you're really making an effort to visit and lobby and make your presence known. So you might say, well, why do I need to do that? Because, and Washington, D.C. obviously is really far from California. And you might say, my nonprofit, we don't have a lot of money. We can't keep going back and forth and making all these trips. Well, you can meet with people locally, but you really want to make sure that you're meeting with the policy people, because elected officials also have people in their offices who are there to solve constituent issues. So for instance, if you were running a small business, you might have called your congressperson and said, hey, is there anyone in the office who can help me figure out how I can fill out my PPP loan, right? Or if you're a nonprofit, you might have done that. Or someone might say, I'm having problems with accessing my Social Security or Medicare, whatever it is, benefits, and that person will help you with that. Those people are different than the policy people. And the policy people is who you want to meet with. So generally, you're going to meet with a policy person, either in your local area, or you're going to make the trip to the Capitol, which is really worth it because then the legislators will see that you've made the effort. But even if you are flying from San Diego to Sacramento and you're only meeting with the policy person, do not despair, because those people are your Sherpas and they will become your friends and they will guide you through this process of helping you to pass legislation. It's really, really important. So these are the dance steps. And as you can see from my explanation, these aren't all the 10, but I picked out a few of the 10 that I think people stumble on most often. And I remembered I wanted to tell you a story at the beginning, which I forgot to do, so I'm going to go back and tell it to you now. About a professional colleague whose name is Paul Downing, and he runs an organization in San Diego called Serving Seniors. And Serving Seniors provides meals for people, seniors, social activities, social services, and they build affordable housing for seniors. I was just at a groundbreaking the other day around the corner from my house, this fantastic senior and family housing complex that they just built. They're an amazing, amazing organization. But what they did is recently they teamed up with this task force on the homeless, and they found that an astonishing number, 1 in 4 homeless people in San Diego are 55 or older. And 43% of those people were first-time homeless. So they went back and they surveyed the people who come to Serving Seniors for meals and social activities. And they found that there was an enormous percentage of them that were paying 50% of their income or more for rent. And they found that if they were able to convince the government, the county government in this case, to provide a shallow subsidy of $500 a month, that would prevent a lot of those seniors from becoming homeless. And as you probably all know, if you know anything about affordable housing, first of all, there's a homelessness crisis across the United States. Rents are just bananas. And it's cheaper to keep people in their housing than to construct new housing and put them there. So they convinced the County of San Diego to establish a pilot program for this $500 shallow rent subsidy. And interestingly, the way they designed it is the subsidy is going directly to the landlord. So that addresses concerns from some conservatives that it might not go towards the rent, it will go directly to the landlord, and hopefully will keep people housed. Now, is a pilot program ideal? Is that everything they wanted? No. Of course, they want everyone who's eligible to be able to access this kind of funding. But it was a magnificent advocacy effort that resulted in a program that will keep seniors housed. So important. And again, it's a little bit of an odd bedfellows example because you have the landlords who don't want to kick out elderly tenants. You have the homelessness people, and you have the people providing senior services as part of your really important coalition that moved that item forward. Okay, that is simple roadmap, or at least elements of the roadmap. I want to assure you, if you work for a 501c3 corporation, lobbying is 100% legal for you. There are rules. I know Abby Levine is going to be on, I think tomorrow. She's going to talk about the rules. You can also go to my website, which is patlibby.com, and I have a video on my website that explains the legal rules for nonprofit lobbying, hopefully in a way that makes sense. The Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy Initiative also has lots of free resources, and I love this. They have a hotline that's free that you can call. So if you have questions, you can ask the legal experts. So they're really terrific resource. But it's 100% legal for a 501c3 corporation to lobby, and registering people to vote. I know the elections just ended, but the next one will be here before we know it. Doesn't even count towards your legal lobbying limits at all, nor does transporting people to the polls. So learn all about those rights as well. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions, and yeah, let's do that. And I also want to remind people, this is my book. You can go onto my website and get a code for a discount on the book, which brings it down to like $17.50. I really wanted, textbooks are so expensive. I really wanted to make this book affordable to people. And again, lots of free resources on my website, blogs, videos that you can access that will help you on these issues. Okay, so let's open it up for questions.
Yes, thanks, Pat. We have a couple in the that folks have submitted, so I'll read those out to you. So the first one is, I'm in a big city, San Francisco.
Yeah.
How do we get an audience with a legislator? It feels much more difficult to get an audience here than I've experienced in the past in smaller cities and towns. And to clarify, she's looking for some strategies for getting an audience. So I don't know, Laura, if you mean the lawmakers in the audience, or getting more advocates to talk to if you want to clarify, that would be great. But how do we get an audience with a legislator? I think it's how do you get in front of a legislator from a big town?
Okay, it shouldn't be hard. The first thing that you have to do is really prepare these steps that I talked about. And I didn't talk about the initial few steps, which is really identifying the issue and doing research on it. You know, when you are working on an issue and you're concerned about whatever it is, chances are you're not the only person who's concerned about that issue. And so you want to figure out, who do we know who's concerned about this issue? Are they registered to vote? Do they live in the district of that person? And then you call that person's office and you say, we would like to meet with you to talk about the beautifully named and framed issue. You explain what it is and say, we are a coalition representing 500, 5,000, however many people. And what elected officials want is they want to do good for their community, and they do, whether they're, you know, black, white, or green, Republicans, Democrats, independents, whatever. People run for office because they want to do good in the world. And your job as a citizen is to help them do good in the world. And they also respond to their constituents. And the constituents are the people who live and vote and sometimes work in their communities. Okay, so those are the people, when you have people who are able to elect them and support them, those are the people they listen to. So it shouldn't be too hard.
I also say, yeah, and I'd also say that oftentimes in bigger cities, they do have a council aide. So if they have a policy council aide or a council aide, I would recommend going through them first and connecting with them, and then you'll probably be able to get in front of the council member as well
Yeah.
later on.
First thing
As
I
a
have to-
form, yeah. go
Should I
ahead.
stop the share? Because I don't think we need to look at my.
No, yes, please stop the
Yeah.
share.
Okay, here we go. That's fine.
As a former Senate staffer, I espouse always making best friends with the staffer, because we're like your Sherpas. We're also gatekeepers, and will allow people access to the lawmaker. And if you're like mean to me or rude or it's not a pleasant experience, I might not want to put you in front of my boss, because who wants to go to work and have another unpleasant experience? So just think about that. Another question we have is, what is the best way to deal with a different party who is steadfast in their opposition? From someone in, I think, Northeast Kentucky. Best way to deal with a different party who's steadfast in their opposition to your issue.
Well, the best thing to do is, if at all possible, try to figure out, is there something, a glimmer of something that you can agree on? That's the best way to start. If you absolutely can't, then you need to try to build the biggest coalition possible in order to move your issue. The gun rights / gun safety argument just drives me crazy. I don't understand why we don't have stronger gun safety legislation in the United States. And I think it's really possible. And I think we have to talk to people. And if you look at the data that says that people who own guns are receptive to this kind of thing, try to find the commonalities. And if you can't, try to just get the biggest tent possible and say, okay, I know you don't agree with us, but here are all these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, I want to echo what Bethany said. One of the stories I like to tell is when I was lobbying in Massachusetts, and I was in front of a budget committee, and it was a big Ways and Means committee, and it was on a Saturday, and I was one of the first people to get there to sign up, because I didn't want to be there all day. And it was my brother-in-law's birthday, and he was having a big party and all this stuff. So the chair of the committee hated my group. He was really against community development, didn't want it in his neighborhood, nothing to do with it, and skipped my name on a list. Mm-hmm. So all day long, it's an auditorium, huge auditorium at the State House. It's packed with people. 5 o'clock at night, I am the last person because he skipped everyone. So I said to him, Chairman Skasha, this must be my lucky day, because my mother always told me good things come to those who wait. And I've been waiting all day to talk to you about community development corporations. And this is, what I want to tell you. And we were funded.
Yeah, that is I think another thing, having lived in Iowa and being an LGBTQ person, I'm a board chair of One Iowa Action, our statewide LGBTQ organization. Iowa introduced the most anti-LGBTQ legislation last year than any other state. So I feel like I feel really well read on this question. I think one of my ways that I approach it is, again, advocacy is not adversarial. And then I always say, I know that we don't meet eye to eye on this, but I just want you to know how this impacts my family.
Good.
And just starting from that, like, I'm not necessarily here. Maybe I am here to change your mind, hopefully. But Yes, I just want to share how this will impact my family, how I live and operate in this community as a queer person, and just want my lawmakers to know that. So I sometimes just acknowledge that we might not go anywhere, but I feel due diligence to have to talk to them and share with them how community members are experiencing things in their community. And then also that we've talked about messaging, messengers, find other messengers, obviously, that do speak to that lawmaker's interests, et cetera. So we only have 5 minutes left. I want to bring up a couple other things that you brought up, Pat. So one of the things you talked about was all the different steps to getting bills passed, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level. And when I do advocacy trainings for my clients, and I work with a lot of trade associations or membership-based 501c3s, oftentimes their members will be like, didn't I already take action on that? Like, I'm like, why are we doing this again? I'm like, because it literally takes from A to B, like from the beginning to the end, a minimum of 7 steps, a minimum. And that's, introduction and a subcommittee to floor, another subcommittee to floor. And that's if everything goes smoothly. So, and if all your lawmakers sit on those, if your lawmakers sit on all those relevant committees, I might ask you to take action 7 times. And so anyway, I always try to explain that it's because I say you are so important. That's how important you are. Your lawmaker sits on these key committees that are so important to us. You're going to get called on all the time to do this. Another thing that you mentioned was about fact sheets. One of the things I think folks forget is I always like to have a fact sheet for the lawmakers, which is kind of similar to what you showed, that has those statistics, the rationale, the information, all that. But also think about what is that fact sheet that you're going to need for other supporters, or you need for other members, or for those coalition people. They might not need that kind of like technical info, but they might need more of like why this matters and why we want you engaged.
Yes.
And then of course you talked a lot about framing, which I completely agree. I want to share one more story. Yeah, I just deal with this all the time, and I think it's hard because one of the issues that some of my healthcare clients deal with, and I know there's some of them are on the line today, is for 340B. 340B, that means nothing to you, Pat. Does that mean anything to you? No. It's about pharmacy, community health clinics, et cetera. And I want to like help rebrand that so bad. Because so it's very important to our healthcare system, but just saying 340B, it says insider knowledge that it doesn't. I always say, could you say this to your grandma and she would understand? And then the last one is obviously coalitions. We're going to be having a great panel tomorrow about coalitions as well. So we have about 3 more minutes with Pat. I have a series of questions that I could ask, and we can talk all day about this stuff because I love it. But I want to make sure that you guys have a chance. You also talked about legislator research template. Also about allowable election activities. Again, I'm just going to plug the Advocacy Pro package, which includes the Advocacy Pro toolkit, which includes those things that I've created to work with my clients and organizations. So I have some of those things that you will have at your ready.
There's also, I have a freebie if people,
yes.
I think. Yeah. So, yep, you can click on that and get my little free guide for doing that. But I also wanted to jump on one thing you said earlier, Bethany. I mean, I'm a nerd girl, so I admit it, that's where I come from. But when you lobby, it's not only facts and figures, but it has to be from lived experience and the heart. And that is really important because that's what resonates with people. Absolutely. When my students were able to change that law for foster youth, that was huge. Getting them subsidies through the age of 26 when the cutoff was 18. They brought foster youth with them to lobby, to talk about how this affected their lives. And the reason they picked age 26 is because that's when most people graduate from college in California. So that they said, look, they're not considered adults. Why should these kids be considered adults when they're 18? So speaking from the heart, not only from statistics, is really, really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another issue that, again, LGBTQ issues, I talked about in the 90s. We talked about with marriage equality, how we talked about we wanted taxes and tax equality, we want to be able to file taxes together. that is not, people do not get married to file taxes together. You know, even gay people don't get married to file taxes together, and straight people don't get married. You get married to build a life with each other and grow a family and have that person in your life. So when we stop talking about the head issue and start talking about the heart issue, that's when we started changing hearts and minds.
Yeah.
So
well, that's why I've stayed married for 28 years.
So you can file taxes together?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. We are at time. This has been so great. We're going to be taking another 15-minute break to get our next, we have a next great panel coming up. It's our funders, associations, and equity panel with 3 awesome panelists. So we're going to cue the music and everyone come back at 1:15 for our next panel. And thank you again.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
Thank you. And while you guys are out on your break, be sure to look up at the Advocacy Pro package. It is going to be, this is the cheapest price. It only gets more expensive from here, folks. So get it today before the price goes up. And we'll see you all back at the 1/4 hour. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
You can stop recording.